Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm finally talking about the new album from Oneohtrix Point Never, Tranquilizer. Yeah, I know this one's taken a long time for me to get to, but hopefully you won't be able to blame me too much since this is a new Oneohtrix Point Never album we're talking about. Daniel Lopatin is one of those artists from the sector of the music world I care about the most, who has the rare privilege of crossing over to other audiences who don't care as much about electronic music, being on Warp Records for over a decade and having worked with loads of high-profile artists behind the scenes, such as The Weeknd, Moses Sumney, FKA Twigs, Charlie XCX, just to name a few. Not to mention having made a name for himself as a film composer on the side for movies like Uncut Gems and Good Time. I think more recently he did the score for Marty Supreme. His work has had a level of cultural penetration that few experimental artists of his stripe have been able to enjoy, and put him in front of lots more eyes that wouldn't ordinarily be paying as much attention to this genre. But even setting aside his popularity, a metric which is in no way indicative of actual quality, I've never remotely disagreed with the level of hype he's amassed, and I think the legendary status he has is more than deserved. He may have had humble beginnings as a semi-straightforward ambient drone artist, as well as a pioneer of the vaporwave subgenre through his Chuck Person side alias, but when he first really broke out to a wider audience through albums like Replica, R+7, and Garden of Delete, there was absolutely no one else out there who sounded remotely like him. Closest comparison that Replica has is maybe Actress, but even that's far from one-to-one, and the two albums after it were even more one-of-a-kind for their time. OPN was taking otherwise conventional blends of samples and synths and editing and rearranging them in such a particular way, forming them into such wild and unconventional shapes that felt, at the time, like they were entirely new ways of making electronic music. Like he was driving forward a new path for the future of the entire genre. Yes, having the Warp Records promotion machine behind him, it certainly helped, but again, I do think the rise of attention he got was fully deserved. And while the OPN albums after Garden of Delete, like Age of, Magic Oneohtrix Point Never, and Again, they may not have had the same game-changing impact as the stuff that first broke him out, but they still delivered such unique blends of sounds that couldn't possibly be mistaken for any other artist. Now, those last two albums in particular were ones that needed a particularly long time to grow on me before they would really click. When Magic Oneohtrix Point Never first came out, my initial reaction was actually somewhat underwhelmed, feeling like he was leaning much more towards experiments into, like, I guess mainstream adjacent pop influence stuff that didn't feel quite as out of the box or imaginative as what I'd come to expect out of him. Though as I sat with it longer, I started to realize how it was showing more emotional vulnerability for him in revealing of the regular human behind the sound wizardry than any other project he'd put out before, and it grew to become one of my very favorite works he's ever made. And Again had a similar arc with me. While that album never connected on quite as deep an emotional level as Magic OPN, it still had the same slow burn effect of me, like, not being sure what to do with it upon its release, unpeeling more and more layers to it and unlocking, like, more interesting sides and angles to it, and showing a level of depth, detail, and creativity that grew enough on me to also easily enter into properly great territory, and notch an honorable mention on my year-end list that year. Obviously, once again, it was the kind of album that only Daniel Lopatin could ever make. Though as for this latest album, Tranquilizer, I have definitely noticed a shift in the critical response to this one, as well as from his core fanbase, after a couple of albums in a row that got, marginally more lukewarm reviews from critics. Here comes an album that's touted as like a major return to form and one of his immediately best received in years. I've already seen it show up on more than one year-end list, because some of you are still, like, really quick to put those out. With how much the guy has been flirting with mainstream adjacent circles, as well as his eventual loss of interest in trying to reinvent the wheel for his sound and style, it would have seemed like the days of him putting out records like the, I guess, simpler, more DIY-ish stuff he was doing in his earlier days were behind him. But this album was most frequently billed as a return to the approach of his most acclaimed work, like Replica and R+7, centered almost entirely around his working with a bunch of sample libraries from the 90s that had been backed up on the Internet Archive, but then deleted. Also collaborating closely with a different artist, Nathan Salon, who I'd never heard of prior to this album's release. As far as I can tell, that guy's primarily worked as like a mix engineer, and his name has shown up on stuff like one of Tim Hecker's film soundtracks, as well as Grand Brothers' Late Reflections, among other things, so that's cool. He's credited with co-producing this whole album and even co-writing about half the track listing on this thing. Now, I'm not going to be speaking much to how much of a difference his contributions made, since honestly I couldn't actually tell the difference. There's not really any set pattern on whether the tracks he contributed to were highlights or lowlights, or even had like a specific sound to them to differentiate them from tracks Lopatin composed by himself. I kinda see why a lot of critics didn't even notice there was a collaborative aspect to the record at all and just treated it as if Lopatin was responsible for everything. But hey, still obviously worth mentioning that it was partially a joint effort, and some of the best tracks here are half credited to him, so yeah, shout out to Nathan Salon. Anyway, putting all that aside, I knew the general tone of this album was going to be, generally more ambient-centric, off the promise of near half the track listing having been released as pre-album singles, although I only briefly previewed through them before the full album dropped out of not wanting spoilers. I was really excited for this, as I always am for any new OPN album, and the fact that it got so much praise from seemingly literally everyone else convinced me all the more that I needed to really sit with this one and let it sink in for a while. And it's now been a little over 2 weeks since it dropped, and unlike his last two albums, my opinion on this thing hasn't really diverged much at all from the way I felt on it when I first put it on, so yeah, but people can't say I wasn't giving it as much thought as I could. So, where I finally landed on with my thoughts on Tranquilizer. It's really good. Really immersive and well-textured New Age-inspired atmospheres with cool edits and experimental structures on the border of greatness. And I wouldn't personally put it among my favorite work of his. I don't think this is even going to get a mention on my year-end list this year outside of maybe an individual track or something. I was listening to this thing so many times over the past 2 weeks. I'm probably past listen 10 or something. And while the experience never wore out on me or got worse in any way, I was also really struggling to get something truly special to click with me on that deeper level, like with what happened with his last two albums, and I don't think I ever successfully got there. I felt like I got really close a few times. There are a bunch of great moments here, and no tracks where I was feeling the urge to hit the skip button, though not all 15 tracks here pulled me in equally. I did find myself semi-regularly tuning out and finding the experience falling into the background, and I was always tuning out in the same spots every time I put it on. It also feels a little weird for me to be saying this about this album because the old album of his this most resembles is R+7, which I've previously gone on record as my personal favorite of his albums. The sound palette of expansive new age synth textures and odd sample manipulations resembles that album more than any of his others, with Replica being the second closest comparison point through the somewhat more simplistic underlying structures and the somewhat off-kilter way through some of those samples are looped. This feels like it should really appeal to my sensibilities, though a big part of the reason that Replica and R+7 have stuck with me as long as they have is because of how little there was to compare them to at the time, how novel and inventive they felt, and in 2025 we have a whole new generation of artists directly inspired by OPN and trying to follow in his footsteps, so just kinda doing the same thing as those albums, while nice, isn't going to hit with the same impact it did over a decade ago. Which, to be fair, I know is also probably kind of part of the point. I've seen Lopatin's interview with Fantano during his last album cycle, where he mentioned that the fact that people had come to expect him to do, new and novel things and, reinvent himself, in itself, felt like it was pigeonholing him. So, no, I don't need the guy to, reinvent the wheel. Finding new and interesting spins and sounds he's already done before was exactly what I enjoyed out of his last two albums. Though it also feels like OPN is intentionally trying to be less showy or out of the box with the edits and sound design, more straightforwardly relying on crafting the soundscapes themselves. And that puts this album in much more direct competition with plenty of other abstract ambient or new age adjacent records I've heard over the course of this year. Much more than he would have been otherwise. All the more heard by the fact that he happened to be unlucky enough to release this album near the end of 2025. A year for electronic music that is, like, a genuinely historic level of stacked. This album does once again have more hits than misses, and enough so where I can see exactly why this is resonating for the people who, aren't listening to electronic and ambient music nearly every single day like I am. I think this is going to be a case similar to the Coma Duster comeback from earlier this year, where I may or may not come off more negative than I actually feel out of having such high expectations for the artist in question. But I also would be lying if I said this consistently impressed me in the way I typically wish for out of a new OPN record. A lot of it does, but not all of it. It's not one of my new favorites from him. So, let's break down what does or doesn't work for me. First of all, the album does start out pretty strong. First we got like a 2-minute intro in For Residue, which combines a few different blends of expansive pads that have like a bit of that old 70s flavor and some kinda Pink Floyd-y guitar strumming. That track's pretty indicative as a tone setter, and it can be a pretty nice attention grabber depending on the listen, although I wouldn't say it's like a major highlight in its own right. I think the first highlight of note is the album's next track, Bumpy, which is still fairly low-key, and occasionally I don't even notice when it starts, but this is like where those classic-era OPN vibes really start to return in the off-kilter, chopped-up rhythmic synth samples that underscore most of the track, and the way all those airy melodic pads wash around it, alongside various old-school MIDI pianos and stuff, eventually culminating in this peaceful but dramatic outro of drones and mildly detuned synth bells. This is one of those tracks where I most agree with the common standpoint people have seemed to have on this project, feeling like a modern, I guess more accessible and welcoming update to the kinds of sounds that first blew OPN up, using the kinds of techniques he learned through his more mainstream adjacent productions to give more emotional weight to similar blends. I do still feel like the more intentionally jumbled and jarring approach to his actual classics are like much more attention-grabbing and interesting for me, but there is definitely something you can get out of these blends that you wouldn't get out of his stuff from his classic era. And tracks like Bumpy are, I guess, kind of the norm for the rest of the album. They're pretty low-key and background music-y stuff on the surface, but with still just enough striking and interesting ideas to peel into to keep me interested. For instance, I have similar feelings on tracks like Modern Lust and Fear of Symmetry, which are, I think, even bigger highlights than Bumpy. Like Modern Lust starts out with more off-kilter loops of like a chopped-up pads, but finds interesting rhythms out of them, and then brings in the sample like a distant trumpet for some jazzy flavor, although a little over the halfway mark changes into a completely different tune made out of more like stripped-back synth melodies. Meanwhile, Fear of Symmetry starts off with lots of jarringly looped piano samples that like hard cut off each other in strange ways, very much in that Replica style. But it also builds into other more expansive instrumentation and wonky keyboard loops, before ending in a tangent of minimal electric piano progressions. Speaking of chopped up pianos recapturing the Replica style, that's also what really hits for me about the track Cherry Blue, one of the comparatively more straightforward cuts on display here, with its pianos going over simpler but thick and somewhat foggy drones, very slightly building up over the course of its running time and hitting on one of the album's strongest emotional notes. Meanwhile, other tracks here lean further into the new agey elements and get something really striking out of them. See all the MIDI kalimbas and pan flutes going over lots of dramatic synth blends on Storm Show, which reach up to some of the album's most intense heights. And also especially the album's closer, Waterfalls, which brings in so many different MIDI instruments from like harps and pianos and saxophones, and those like 80s xylophone-y type synths, with big organic percussion textures echoing out over field recordings of water sloshing around. The sound palette borders on something you'd hear out of like 90s Tangerine Dream or something, but a heck of a lot more compositionally striking than pretty much anything that band actually came up with in that era. That makes for a particularly strong finish to this thing, and was my favorite track on here for a period of time. Though the album isn't just light and fluffy atmospherics and 90s new age throwbacks, there's a handful of much more energetic moments here as well to like really give this stuff that special Oneohtrix point never edge. The track D.I.S. comes to mind. That's definitely the track where, like, the pad chords that run through most tracks on this thing reach, like, their highest intensity, as they even get, like really chopped up and stab away at high speed over, like, much more frantic feeling rhythms. And the third track, Lifeworld, also comes to mind, which brings in all these, like, intense sound effects that almost kind of sound like rewinding tapes, as well as, like, thicker loops of organic percussion that really give this track a more forward momentum than I think any other track on the album. And the way all the big expansive pads and melodies and chopped up, almost Mellotron-like hook, like, kind of swirl around it is legit pretty epic. This is probably the album's equivalent to World Outside from his last album in being the track I'm most likely to remember longer term, even if it may technically be among the more straightforward on display here, with, like, its simple swapping of A and B sections, like verses and choruses. I think that's probably my actual favorite track on the album overall. It's the one that gets me, like, the most excited, even though most of the rest of the album isn't really trying to get you excited like that. But there's also the penultimate track, Rodl Glide, is... Holy fuck. Letting that one go to voicemail. But there's also the penultimate track, Rodl Glide, as well. That track isn't energetic all the way through, and in fact the entire first half of the track is like this much lonelier blend of, like, sparse and empty pads and a very light hip-hop beat that sort of adds up to, like, a little bit of the classic vaporwave aesthetic, I guess, or something adjacent to it. But, like, halfway through the track, it suddenly almost turns into, like, a hard-hitting acid techno cut for a second. It then switches into, like, lots of high-energy 90s rave-stabbing synth chords, builds up to even higher intensity with bigger and bigger chords and pads laying over on top of each other, and eventually just kind of ending in the same place the track started. Yeah, this track definitely lives up to being the longest cut in the bunch. It is only 6 minutes, but it makes a lot of good use of that length. But yeah, as many big highlights like these as there is also a decent handful of tracks that just kind of bounce off me and do more to make the experience fall into the background as a whole. Cuts that feel a little like interstitial filler and don't add much unique flair that other cuts here wouldn't. I feel like probably the biggest culprit for me is the track Vestigel, which I feel like I should like more given it does have a lot of change-ups between, like, thick but peaceful noise drones, air-style synth strings, warbling synth blends, cascades of electric pianos, and more. But none of these ideas really grab my attention that much on their own in context, and they never feel like they're adding up to something more than the sum of their parts. It's just like a kind of a mess of ideas that don't really connect, I guess. It's probably the single most likely track on the album for me to just not even notice as playing at all, or maybe even feel like the project is starting to feel like it's just kind of aimlessly meandering. I also wasn't really grabbed by the title track and its kind of monotone dub techno adjacent drones, or the track Petro, whose mixes of clanky and dull keyboard chords going up next to, like, I guess synthesized breathing noises and more kinda retro MIDI flute textures in other parts. Maybe tracks like these are able to hit better if you, like, purely take them in a vacuum, but in the greater context of the album, they just kind of feel like they're, like, repeating ideas I've heard elsewhere and presenting them in a less interesting way. I suppose with enough repeat listens, I did eventually warm up to the track Measuring Ruins, whose mixes of peaceful synth pads and melodic washes are among the very most peaceful on the album, with a striking enough melody to be able to set itself apart from the track listing, as well as some mildly cool stuttering effects and stuff. But that track was also my least favorite on the album for a while, since these kinds of synth blends feel like they could have come from, like, any ambient synth composer, following after the traditions of, like, your Brian Eno and Tangerine Dream and all the others. And I still wouldn't really call that one a major highlight. And I suppose I can also give a mild shout to Bell Scanner, whose mixes of muted drones and twinkling bells with some light melodic washes swirling around it in the second half, those were decently striking enough too, but that track's also, like, just an interlude at less than 2 minutes, and it's another one where I'm more likely to not even notice it's playing at all. So yeah, I guess that's everything on Tranquilizer. A really fascinating ambient record that I really wish I were even more fascinated by than I am. All of this material is certainly well crafted for what it is, even in the least interesting moments. The atmospherics are plenty immersive all the way through, and lots of moments we're able to hit on pretty strong emotional notes. There's always just enough of those little creative twists and turns to prevent my attention from falling away for too long and, like, getting fed up with the experience or getting bored or something. But the album as a whole is a little uneven, a little bumpy, one might say. Not every track is able to hit me as effectively as the next. And once again, considering this is a Oneohtrix Point Never album, I went in hoping to get the kind of imaginative and out-of-the-box experience that only he and no other artist in the world could deliver. Even if it just stuck to formulas he's already done before, he has carved out such a specific niche that he can get away with some retreads. But this definitely isn't among his most interesting executions of these ideas, and it's been all the more difficult to, really sign off on this as one of the very best of the year, or within the best within his catalog, when I feel like I've already gotten several directly comparable experiences out of much more underground ambient artists over the course of this year alone. For a few examples, Cosmic Astral by Memory Pearl, that had a lot of similar 90s New Age throwbacks that hit on just as solid emotional notes as many of this album's bigger highlights. Not as abstract about it, but, There's Weird Dot Fishes by Lider. That's a more traditional ambient record with a lot less structure than this, but its sound is just as expansive and well-textured and immersive as this album, if not even more. There's also Six Dimensional Space by Psi Cubed. That's S-A-I with a 3 exponent. It was released on the Neotantra label. That album's just as consistently investing, if not an even more investing trip through, mildly abstract and ambient and new age throwbacks. Maybe a tiny bit less expansive on a production level, but it has a much greater variety of sounds and feels even more well fleshed out in my opinion. Also, literally the day before Tranquilizer came out, I listened to an album called Through the Crystal Window by the artist Thorjn, Thorjn, and by pure coincidence, that feels like almost the exact same album as Tranquilizer. Less new age throwbacky and a little more intense and synth driven, I suppose, but definitely taking some very direct inspiration from classic era OPN in its free-flowing, unstructured atmospheric abstractions. Definitely feel like if you like one of those albums, you will like the other. I'm not going to say all of these albums are better than Tranquilizer, but I do feel like all of them are easily comparable in quality, and they're getting a fraction of the attention. Now, I am all for OPN stepping back and doing something more conventional. I mean, more conventional ambient drone material was where he started way back in the day, and I do think there's plenty more interesting detail in these mixes than there are in, his really early Rifts era material. I think there might be more of substance here than Returnal as well, even though that album also has the benefit of feeling, more unique for the time it was released in. That would probably still get the slight edge for me, I think, although I'm not sure. I mean, hey, if Tranquilizer had come from, an underground artist that I had never heard of before, I probably would have been going to bat for it a lot more than I am. Also, I feel like if this had come from an underground artist you'd never heard of, I feel like way more of the people calling this one of the best of the year would have never even tried to give this the time of day in the first place, let alone held it up as much as they are. Feel like a lot of y'all are still a lot more married to the idea that popularity is an indicator of quality than some of you would like to admit. But because this is Oneohtrix Point Never, an artist who has so much more popularity and hype behind him, that pretty much everyone who regularly follows this channel already intimately knows, and for some people, this will be the only abstract ambient new agey throwback they listen to all year, if maybe not even just the only electronic album some people will have tried to listen to all year. As someone who's immersed so much more deeply in this genre than, other more popular critics, and knows both how much comparable quality there is in the underground, as well as how well this guy in particular can fare when he actually is at his best, I kinda left this experience wanting more from it than what I got. I have long bought into OPN's hype as much as I have, because it did genuinely feel like no one else in the world, underground or otherwise, was doing the kind of stuff he was doing. And I can't say I feel the same way about this album. By his standards, it's kind of plain and a bit underwhelming for me. But again, that's more of a testament to the bar he set for himself. Slightly underwhelming by his standards is still really good. I can't imagine anyone actually needs my recommendation to hear this. If you're a regular follower of my channel, you most likely have already had your opinion on this album cemented weeks ago, and I would not be surprised if I end up getting totally ratioed in the comments over my take, seeing how it seems like literally everyone else I've seen has been talking about this one as one of his very best works to date. I personally can't say I think it's quite that level of special for me, but I did still enjoy all the time I spent with it, so I guess take all of that as you will. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.